Buenos días, estimados amigos y amigas. Es un gusto y un honor para nosotros, para la Universidad Católica del Perú, para el Grupo Interdisciplinario de Investigación Mente y Lenguaje y para Estudios Generales Letras, tener a Jesse Prinz entre nosotros. Jesse Prinz estudió su pregrado en filosofía en la Universidad de Nueva York y su doctorado en la Universidad de Chicago. Es un muy reconocido y apreciado filósofo contemporáneo. Sus especialidades serían filosofía de la mente, filosofía moral y también una rama de la filosofía relativamente reciente, de la cual él es precisamente uno de los creadores, que es lo que él ha denominado empirical philosophy, filosofía empírica, es decir, no empirista, ¿no? No filosofía empirista, eso ya había, ¿no? Filosofía empírica. ¿Qué cosa sería la filosofía empírica? Bueno, sería más o menos esto, ¿no? Utilizar las evidencias, los datos empíricos procedentes de la psicología, procedentes de las neurociencias, procedentes de las ciencias sociales, de la antropología, de la sociología, para corroborar o para falsar tesis filosóficas. Esto genera un interesante debate metafilosófico. Ustedes saben que entre los filósofos existe el debate sobre cómo hacer para validar una teoría filosófica por sobre otra. Si tenemos dos teorías filosóficas que sostienen tesis opuestas, ¿cómo hacer para favorecer una y no otra? Hasta hace muy poco tiempo, el único elemento que utilizaban los filósofos era el argumento, pero por supuesto siempre hay buenos argumentos para sostener cualquier cosa. Entonces, Jesse Prinz es partidario del uso masivo de la información empírica y así ha desarrollado esta empirical philosophy. Es autor de libros muy valiosos, recientes. Uno de ellos es Gut Reactions, algo así como reacciones viscerales, sería en castellano. También The Emotional Construction of Morals, la construcción emocional de la moral, y su último libro se titula Beyond Human Nature, más allá de la naturaleza humana. Entonces vamos a escuchar a Jesse Prinz, quien nos va a hablar sobre las relaciones entre moral y emociones.
Gracias. Necesito decir, lo siento, porque no voy a hablar en español. Pero tienen ustedes suerte porque mi español es sumamente mal. But if I speak too quickly, let me know. Okay. I'm going to talk about moral judgment. So when you make a moral judgment, you're making a judgment of the form that something is bad or something is good. Something is immoral or moral, something is a moral obligation or morally impermissible. And within the history of philosophy, there have been different theories of moral judgment, but the most important division is a debate that you can find represented in historical figures such as David Hume here and Immanuel Kant. So for Hume, making a moral judgment is fundamentally about having an emotional response. So Hume thinks that when you believe that something is morally wrong, you're expressing your emotional attitudes. But for someone like Kant, emotion really has much more to do with abstract thought, with reason. So Kant thinks that when we make a moral judgment, we're using reason to derive the conclusion that something is permissible or impermissible. He thinks that emotions often occur when we make moral judgments, but that this is a bad thing, and we should eliminate the emotions from morality, and that we can make moral judgment using reason alone. The difficulty arises because both Kant and Hume are extremely good philosophers. And because they're extremely good philosophers, it's very difficult to decide which one of them is correct. They're both too smart. And their followers are also too smart, so what we find in the history of philosophy since the 17th and 18th centuries is a tendency to find a debate with no resolution. People disagree, but no side has claimed victory. So you can see Kant here is hitting Hume. And it's a very powerful blow, but Hume is ready to hit back, and they keep on fighting. ¿Tienen ardillas aquí en Perú? No? Sí, sí. So if you've ever seen two squirrels fighting, you know none of them ever wins. It's not like one squirrel kills the other squirrel. They wrestle a little and then it's over. Philosophers are a bit like that. So sometimes to make progress on philosophical problems, we need to move outside of philosophy and study the philosophical questions more empirically. And if you think about the question at hand, the question we're asking, it is a question of whether people are having emotional responses when they engage in moral cognition, moral thought. And to study that question, we can ask what's going on actually inside of our heads when we make moral judgments. So we can study what's going on inside the head using the methods of cognitive science, including neuroscience and psychology. I'll say very little about neuroscience here, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there have now been many studies looking at morality in the brain. And people are given different kinds of problems. So, for example, here people are asked to consider a sentence, and they're asked, is this sentence expressing something that's morally wrong or factually wrong, wrong in a non-moral way? And in this study, people were presented with pictures, photographs of things that were morally wrong. In this study, people were presented with a kind of economic game where they were presented with another player in the game who could do something fair or unfair. And in this study, people are presented with moral dilemmas, and they need to make a decision, what's the correct thing to do. Very, very different experimental design. But in each case, we see that the significant brain areas that are active when people make moral decisions are areas that are associated with emotion. So every study that's been done on the moral brain has revealed an emotional brain, the emotional brain at work. So we have a lot of evidence that emotions are in fact actively involved in moral decision making. But a problem with neuroscience in general is that the methodology is correlational. So it says when you're making a moral judgment, you're also having an emotion. But it doesn't tell you which one comes first. So there are three possibilities. Maybe the emotion causes the judgment, maybe the emotion is part of the judgment, or maybe the emotion is a consequence of the judgment. The judgment causes the emotion. But if the judgment causes the emotion, we haven't yet found evidence that emotions are essential to moral judgment. Immanuel Kant could say, yes, when you use reason to make a moral judgment, once you've made this moral judgment, you also get very emotional about it, but the emotion is not really important. It's not essential to making the judgment itself. So this kind of evidence can't really decide whether Kant is right or whether Hume is right. So we need to move from correlation to causation. A lot of this work has been done by psychologists, so psychological methods are in a good position to look for cause and effect. This was a study done by a psychologist named Simone Schnall and her collaborators, and she gave participants little stories like this one. So I'll read it to you. It says, Frank's dog was killed by a car in front of his house, so he cut up the body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. How wrong was that? So how bad is it to eat your pet dog? And most people think it's kind of bad to do this, but not that bad. There could be worse things. But what Simone Schnall did is she had her participants either sitting at a normal desk, a normal table like this, or at a very dirty table that had, this is a pizza carton with grease and a pencil that's been chewed, eaten, and a tissue that's been used, and a drink that's been also left to dry. So it's a kind of a dirty environment, and at the dirty environment, people think that this is more wrong. The explanation is that what is going on in this case is the environment is causing disgust. ¿Cómo se dice? Asco? See? So it's causing disgust, and the disgust is then being used as information about the moral scenario. So one way to understand this is to say that when you're asked, is something right or wrong, or how bad is this, you introspect and you discover your feelings. And if your feelings are very intense, you say it's very wrong. If your feelings are less intense, you say it's less wrong. But sometimes the feeling comes from the heart, comes from within, under ordinary circumstances, but in some cases the feeling can be manipulated by the environment. And so many studies now have shown this. In another study by John Haidt and Thalia Wheatley, people were hypnotized to feel disgust when they heard a certain word. A very ordinary word, in this case it was the word often, and it's not a very disgusting word, but when they were hypnotized to feel disgust when this word was used, they found that things were more morally wrong. For example, they were told that there is a student who often brings good speakers to campus, speakers that both the faculty and the students are interested in hearing from. And then they're asked, how bad is this person? And of course, for ordinary participants who have not been hypnotized, this person isn't bad at all. But if you've been hypnotized to feel disgust when you hear the word often, and now you're told a person often brings good speakers to campus, you start to think that this person is very bad. And you say, I don't like this guy, I think he's not very good, so they have to come up with an explanation for why this guy is bad. I've done some of my own experimental work looking at this effect. So in one study, we gave people different beverages, a sweet beverage, a neutral beverage, and a bitter beverage. This was work done in collaboration with a psychologist named Kendall Eskin. It's primarily his research. And then we asked people questions about morality, and we found that as compared to the sweet beverage and the neutral beverage, people who had a very bitter beverage found the same moral scenarios more wrong. They're more bad if you just drink something bitter. These two studies that I just mentioned, with these three studies with the bitter beverage and the hypnosis and the dirty table, they all manipulate one emotion, which is disgust. They manipulate asco. But there's another emotion that's extremely important for morality as well, and that's the emotion of anger, ira. So we wanted to find a way to manipulate anger, and this is work that I did with Angelica Seidel, a psychology graduate student, and again, she did all of the work. And what we did is we chose a piece of music that's very unpleasant to listen to. So I don't know if any of you have been exposed to what's called noise music. It's popular in Japan, so there are different kinds, but we use Japanese noise music, and it's extremely irritating. So I'll play it for you, so you have the pleasure of being irritated by our music. Stop? Okay. So that song is 13 minutes long. we only played 1 minute, and 1 minute was enough to get people really irritated. I played it for you for maybe 10 seconds, so imagine that times 6. It's very unpleasant. And then we gave people moral vignettes, moral scenarios, and in each case, the people who had been exposed to this music as opposed to no music judged that those scenarios were more morally wrong. Where people hear about a person who finds a wallet on the street and takes the cash, takes the money from the wallet before returning it, how bad is that? There's somebody who gives a lie and misinformation on a resume for a job application. How wrong is that? And then there's a scenario where somebody is driving on the highway and they cut their car, they move their car in front of somebody else in an aggressive way. How wrong is that? And in each case, anger makes people think these are more wrong. Now, what this kind of evidence shows is that emotions are not just effects of moral judgment, they can be causes. The emotion is influencing the moral judgment. So the best explanation of this data is that the way people make a moral judgment is that they introspect and they see, how am I feeling? What is my emotional response to this? And then they report the intensity of their emotion. But that only shows that we can use emotions as information. It doesn't yet show that emotions are necessary. And this is maybe the hardest thing to establish, and I think the evidence for the claim that emotions are necessary for morality is still incomplete. But I think there is some good evidence. One piece of evidence simply comes from the way people learn to be moral. So how many of you have interacted with a baby, with a small child? So you've all held a baby, like a little child. And if you interact with a baby, you discover, like this, that babies are evil. They do terrible things. So babies, if you hold the baby up and you're being very nice, it tries to hit your face, it scratches, it pulls. I have a very big nose, it pulls on that, they pull your hair. The babies are little monsters. And they make a lot of noise. You bring a baby to a lecture, and everyone here has learned to be very polite, and you're very quiet. If a baby was here, it's terrible. They're making a lot of noise. They don't even know how to go to the bathroom in an appropriate place. So terrible, terrible monsters. But we correct their behavior. We teach them to be good. We teach them to be little angels. And we do that through emotions. So the way babies are conditioned to arrive at a moral understanding involves manipulation of the emotions. So you can threaten a baby with punishment, and that induces fear. You can induce empathy in a baby or a young child by drawing their attention to the suffering that they have caused in another person. So if a young child sees another child crying, the young child who caused that crying to occur will start to cry as well. It's not usually the case, so children will hurt each other without any guilt at all. But if you take the child who's hurt another child and really put her face in the fact that she's caused this pain in the other child, so look, mira, you just keep showing them the suffering of another child, eventually they start to cry too. So you get this kind of emotional association. And the most powerful method of all is something called withdrawal of love. So if you take away love, you take away your affection, a child will become very upset. So we do this often with children. If a child is being very bad, you say, I'm not going to play with you anymore, I don't like kids like you, you're not my friends, and you walk away. Or maybe you send the child to a corner or to another room. All these methods of separating yourself from the child make the child very upset. Each of these methods is a form of emotional conditioning. We have a behavior that the child engages in, and we associate it with a negative emotion, and through that, the children learn to become moral. But some children are incapable of learning this way because they don't have healthy emotional responses. So if you look at people like psychopaths, people who are born with psychopathic tendencies, have a very reduced response to negative emotions. It's very difficult to make them sad. It's very difficult to scare them. It's very difficult to induce a kind of empathy response. And as a result, they can't form these negative emotional associations with their behavior, and they never develop a true sense of morality. So you can look at scales of moral development, and you can show that For psychopaths, their capacity to understand morality is really like a very, very young child. They understand that these rules exist, but they don't really feel anything about them. They treat moral rules as if they're merely conventional rules of etiquette. So I think this kind of evidence suggests that if you don't have an emotional capacity, your ability to understand the nature of morality is lost. One way to think about it is that a psychopath is morally blind. It's as if they cannot see this domain. So that suggests that emotions are necessary for morality, that emotions are used in making moral judgments. Emotions may also be sufficient for moral judgments. So you can imagine somebody saying, well, maybe emotions are necessary, but we need reason as well. But you can show that even when people are very bad at reasoning, they can still make moral judgments, and they'll continue to make those moral judgments when their reasons give away, when they don't have reasons. So one example of this comes from research by John Haidt, together with his collaborators Bjorklund and Murphy. And what they wanted to show is that when people consider a case of incest between a brother and sister, they will continue to think that that's morally bad, even if they can't provide a reason, a justification for this judgment. So this is a real-world case. In this photograph, these two people are brother and sister. And they're a German couple. They were raised separately, but they met when they were young, and they knew they were brother and sister, but they fell in love, and then they ended up having 2 children, and they got married. And when the German court discovered that they were brother and sister, they broke up the marriage, they took the children away, and they sent the man to prison. So it's very illegal, but this is a complicated case because it seems to be a case of 2 adults who were consenting. They were in love, they were doing this willingly. So now the question arises, what's wrong with consensual incest? What's wrong with incest in a case where both parties are both adults and they both want to have this relationship? And when John Haidt and his collaborators asked this question to students at the University of Virginia, the students couldn't come up with justifications. They tried, but each time they came up with a justification, the researchers changed the scenario in a way that made that justification irrelevant. For example, why is it bad for a brother and a sister to have an intimate sexual relationship? People will say, well, their children will have birth defects. So you can tell them, well, no, it's actually okay. In this case, the couple used birth control, they used condoms, and she was taking the pill, and there's no risk of having children. Well, maybe they're going to be traumatized or corrupted by this event. Well, no, this is a consensual couple. They really love each other. It was a very positive experience. It wasn't harmful for them in any way. Well, maybe the community will be badly affected. Maybe people will start to engage in incest more frequently. And you say, no, it was their secret. Nobody else knew about it. They didn't tell anyone. They always kept secrets very successfully. And people go through every possible justification. They say, maybe it's wrong in the Bible. It's possible. But of course, when they say that, they're inventing it. They don't know where in the Bible it says incest is wrong. So the researchers say, are you a Christian? And they say, yes. Oh, so you mean the Christian Bible with the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Abraham tradition that begins with Abraham, that tradition, that's your religion? They say, yes. They say, did you know Abraham was married to his half-sister? So it's obviously pure invention. People are just trying to come up with a justification. And finally, most of them admit they have no argument that they can give in favor of the conclusion that incest is wrong. But 80% continue to say that it's wrong. So even without reason, people continue to use their emotional response. They think it's wrong because it's disgusting. So the best explanation of this pattern of response is the one that was given by our friend David Hume. So Hume says that when you believe that something is morally bad, it's because you have a sentiment of disapprobation towards it, a negative sentiment towards it. If you believe that it's good, it's because you have a positive sentiment towards it. Believing that something is immoral or moral is a matter of how we feel. So this position would make Hume very happy, will make Hume smile. There's a little bit of terminology in Hume's formulation that I think is important to clarify. So Hume often uses the word sentiment, and en español, como en inglés, tenemos dos palabras, sentimientos y emociones. And I think it's useful to distinguish these two words, sentiment and emotion. And also, in both Spanish and English, we have a word disapprobation, desaprobio, and it's in English, it's not used very often in contemporary English. Is it used in Spanish more? So, but there's a question: what is desaprobio? What kind of emotion is that? And I think it's useful to think of desaprobio not as the name of a single feeling, but as a family of different feelings. There are different kinds of disapprobation. Let's begin by distinguishing sentiments and emotions. So I just came up from the south, from Cusco, and I had this nice little cuy here for lunch, and it was so wonderful. So I really like these guys to eat, also as friends. It's good to eat your friends. So what is it to like a food? What does it mean when you say, I like, me gusta cuy? What does that mean? What are the emotions? Well, when I eat the animal, I feel pleasure. So liking a food is partially a matter of finding pleasure in eating it. But there are other emotions as well. So if I'm in a restaurant and I see one of you eating the cuy and I'm not eating it, I might feel jealousy. So it's no longer pleasure, now it's jealousy. And we can't eat this in the United States. You can't find it there for food. So when I leave, I'm going to feel envy. I'm going to wish I was back in Peru. And if I arrive at a restaurant and I order it from the menu and they say, oh, we don't have it anymore, then I'm going to feel sad. So to like something is not just to take pleasure in it, it's to feel envious if someone else has it, it's to feel sad if you can't have it, and so on. So liking is a sentiment. It's not a single emotion. To like is not a single emotion, but a family of different emotions. And I think we need to think about approbation and disapprobation in a similar way. They name families of emotions. And one of the ways in which moral psychology has been advancing in recent years has been developing a theory of the different emotions that are involved in moral judgment, an emotional division of labor. You can see that when you present people with different kinds of moral scenarios, the scenario can cause a very different response in the brain. So again, using neuroimaging, this is from a study by Parkinson and colleagues. When presented with a case where one person harms another person, hurts another person, you see a certain pattern of brain activation. When somebody is presented with a case of something that we would consider morally impure, like incest, you see a different pattern of activation. And I won't now walk you through these different brain areas, but what's important for this is just that you get very different brain response for different kinds of moral norms. So let's consider what's going on here. So consider a case of harm. One form of harm is if you physically hurt someone or if you take their property. So if you see this event where somebody takes the necklace from another person, what emotion would you feel? What do you think? No puedo oír. Anger, yes. Thanks. Ira. So this makes you angry. But consider a very different kind of moral scenario. Suppose I tell you that I have this lovely little cat at home, my sweet little kitten, and she's so cute that I find her irresistible. But not just irresistible in the conventional way. So sometimes I have her sit on my lap, and you can kind of imagine that she becomes this source of a special kind of erotic pleasure for me. And so I won't give you the details, but she's not hurt, but she brings me sexual pleasure by contact. So what emotion do you feel towards me now? Yeah, so this time it's no longer anger, but disgust. And you can show that these different emotions are associated with different kinds of norms. So, for example, a psychologist named David Pizarro. Pizarro is funny because there's a place for which Pizarro is very significant historically. Actually, David Pizarro is Central American by origin, I think. I can't remember. He's a good friend, but I've forgotten. David gave people a scale, a measurement tool to find out how much disgust they experience in their life. So you can just look at, we don't need to read it all, but take one example. So when you go to a public bathroom, a public toilet, you try to avoid to have contact with the toilet, like maybe you put paper on the seat or you find some elaborate way, this kind of thing. Some people are very disgusted. They're all the time disgusted. It turns out that the people who are very disgusted all the time are more likely to be against abortion and against gay marriage and against other norms that have to do with sexuality. So they transfer their general capacity for disgust to the moral domain. But they don't have a greater tendency to be opposed to things that involve physical harm. It's just these cases of sexuality. And if you remove disgust, so for instance, there's some evidence that people with Huntington's disease, which is a disorder of the nervous system where your brain starts to atrophy, you can lose your capacity for disgust. And people with this condition start to show patterns of behavior that is called paraphilic behavior. It means sexually abnormal behavior. And this is too hard to read, but you see people who do things like indecent exposure, where they show their body to others and so on. Various kinds of perversity, transsexualism, exhibitionism, obscene phone calls. So you lose your capacity for disgust, and you say, maybe I should call someone and start to... It's interesting. So that kind of evidence is correlational. We wanted to show experimentally that if you induce disgust or anger, the effects are different. And this data that I'm about to present to you is actually is new. We've been collecting it for a while, but the data I'm about to show you I actually received from my collaborator, Angelika Seidel, late last night. So you were the first to see it, the second to see it, third to see it. She saw it first, I saw it second. We played people music that was either irritating, like that Japanese noise music, or disgusting sounds. And we couldn't find disgusting music. If anyone has ideas about disgusting music, let me know. But we played disgusting sounds. We actually played the sound of vomiting. It's my symbol for vomiting. Here's what happened. And some people heard no music at all. So when we gave people a crime against a person, like harming someone, as compared to the control condition where people have no music, the disgust and the control look exactly the same. Green is disgust, blue is control. But when they heard music that was irritating, they found these crimes significantly more bad, more immoral. And for crimes against nature, these are these cases of things like incest or cannibalism, things that violate the body. Again, there's no difference in this case between anger and the control condition, but the disgust induction made these kinds of crimes more bad. So what you can see is this very selective impact of anger on certain kinds of immoral acts where somebody is harmed, and a selective impact of disgust on these cases that involve some kind of impurity. Okay? So these are all emotions you feel towards another person. So if you hear about a person who engages in immoral behavior, you might feel anger, you might feel disgust. But what if you yourself are a bad person or commit an immoral act? I know most of you are thinking, I'm such a saint, I would never do anything bad. So I wanted to conduct an experiment where I could give people believable cases of immorality, so very mild cases of immorality. So for example, imagine where you take something from someone but you never return it. So how many of you have ever taken a book from the library and then forgotten to bring it back? So this can happen. Or this is a case, people talk about masturbation as immoral, and sometimes you say, oh no, in the contemporary societies, masturbation is not considered immoral. And when I hear people say that, I say, well, if it's not immoral, why can't we masturbate in public? So masturbation, it's true, we don't consider the act intrinsically evil, but if it's done in the wrong place, it becomes immoral. But sometimes it's done in the wrong place accidentally. Like, you can't be walking through the street and accidentally masturbate. It's not likely to occur. You're sitting on the metro and it happens by accident. But maybe you live with someone, you have a roommate who lives with you, and maybe you're masturbating innocently at home in your shared bathroom or on your shared sofa or something, and your roommate catches you in this act. And now the question is very simple. What do you feel? And in this study, I actually gave people a choice between two emotions, between guilt and shame. So, pena y culpa. So I can ask you, so what would you feel if you took a book and never returned it? What emotion would you feel? How many say shame, pena? How many say guilt, culpa? Okay, so, and how about with this? So more voted for guilt. And what about the second case? So your roommate catches you masturbating. How many say shame? How many say guilt? So we see a real split, and that's exactly what the data look like. So for crimes against persons, people feel guilt, and for crimes against nature, they feel shame. So the basic story is that you get these different emotional responses depending on what kind of crime it is and who's committing the crime, whether it's another person or whether you yourself. So we have a kind of emotional landscape. Disapprobation is the disposition to feel one of these different negative emotions, but it depends on what kind of crime and who the actor is. What about approbation? So what do you feel when you see somebody doing something very good? Here, I don't think we have done enough research to have a very firm answer. But one thing is very clear. When you see somebody acting morally good, doing something good, like engaged in an act of charity, of helping people in need, the emotion you feel is positive. You feel a positive emotion. And this can be shown in various ways, through neuroimaging, for example. Jorge Moll, a Brazilian neuroscientist, exposed people to cases of charity, and he found that there was activity in the ventral striatum, which is the reward center of the brain. Kendall Eskin, my collaborator in part of his dissertation research, did work where he showed that altruism makes things sweet. So he gave people a beverage, which was a mildly sweet beverage. You have Gatorade here. Yeah, so if you take a little Gatorade and put it in water, so it's 90% water, and people taste agua as a little sweet, and you ask, how good does this taste? People say it tastes pretty good, but if you expose them to stories of altruism first, so you read them a story about somebody who's very altruistic, the Gatorade tastes even sweeter. So altruism makes the world sweeter. Angelica Seidel and I did a study. Again, she did all the work. And we wanted to show that positive emotions can be induced in a way that affects morality. So we used music. This is a piece of music by the composer Grieg. And you'll see it's a very cheerful piece of music. It's almost, I find this music kind of disgusting. I would rather listen to the Japanese noise, but that's too much information. Okay. So it's very sweet music. After listening to this music, we ask people various moral questions. So we say, how good would it be to help a person who's homeless? He's living in his car. And this is maybe a very North American example. I imagine somebody who's homeless in Peru doesn't have a car. But in North America, I don't know, the home, anyway, they all have cars, but I don't have a car, but you get the idea. He's lost his home, but he still has his car, and he's living there, and he asks you to buy him dinner, and the question is, are you obligated to do this, and how good is it to help this person? And the music makes people think that this is morally better. So hearing happy music makes people form more positive moral judgments. This has also been shown in the context of trolley dilemmas. So how many of you have learned about the trolley dilemma? Any of you? Okay. So this is a moral dilemma that was developed by philosophers that's been used now by many psychologists to study morality. And here's one version of it. So you learn that there's a trolley or a train going down a track, and it's going to kill 5 people. They're going to be killed. But this is you. Con la pela azul, acá, and you're standing on a bridge, and there's a big guy next to you, and if you simply push that guy in front of the trolley, in front of the train, the 5 people will be saved. He's so big that he's going to stop the trolley, and they'll be saved, which is really wonderful news. Unfortunately, he'll be crushed. He's dead. So you can kill this guy in order to save these 5. And now we have a moral dilemma. Is it okay to kill one person in order to save 5 people? So how many of you think that it is okay, it's morally acceptable to push this guy in front of the trolley? So raise your hand if you think it's acceptable. How many of you think it's morally bad to push this guy in front of the trolley? Okay, so this is typical. The majority think it's very bad to push this guy in front of the trolley. 2 psychologists, Piercarlo Valdesolo and David DeSteno, did an experiment where they gave people that question, but they used emotion induction before the question. Some people saw a film that apparently is very boring in North America about Spain, a little film about a Spanish village. Maybe North Americans don't care about Spain, but they really care about this. So this is a comedian from Saturday Night Live. And after watching this really funny guy for a while, they're asked the same question: is it okay to push somebody in front of the train? And as you can see from the data, they're 3 times more likely to say it's okay to push somebody in front of a train, kill 1 person to save 5, after watching the comedy, after watching the funny film. So humor, which produces positive emotions, makes us think that it's okay to help people even when you have to harm someone. So one way to think about this is that it involves the link between approbation and positive emotion. So here you are again on the bridge, and you're thinking, what shall I do? And when you think about saving these people, that makes you happy. The idea of saving people brings out a positive emotion. You think this would be really good. It would make me feel very good to do this. But when you think about killing this guy in order to save people, that makes you very sad. So it's positive emotion and negative emotion in a clash, in a battle. But we can imagine that, so some of you raised your hand and said it's okay to kill this guy, or maybe you've just been listening to the comedian. So after listening to the comedian, the happy emotion is now more powerful than the negative emotion. The negative emotion is suppressed, and now you think, okay, I'll kill that guy. Okay? So that's a basic story about what's going on here. As I said before, yeah. Yeah, good question. So I was very bothered by this. So this is a comedian called Chris Farley who's on Saturday Night Live. I don't know if it's known here, but he's a very, very big guy. It's a serious confound. After watching Chris Farley, I want to kill all big guys everywhere. In the actual scenario they use, they don't talk about the guy on the bridge as being fat. They just say a big person. But others have replicated this effect. So there's a nice paper by someone named Strominger where she used a very different induction of humor and got the same effect. And in some of the work that we've been doing, we're also seeing this effect. But it's a very serious worry. At this point, we know experimentally that positive emotions can affect moral judgment, but we haven't yet done a lot of scientific work to figure out which positive emotions have these effects. And I won't spend any time on this slide, but just as a project for those of you who are interested in moral psychology, it's useful to try and draw division of labor to differentiate these different positive emotions, and maybe different emotions play different roles in morality. So if you see somebody doing a good thing for someone else, you might feel admiration. But if that person does something good for you, you might feel gratitude. You might feel thankful. So different emotions in different cases. Okay. I could stop here. I could spend a few minutes on objections. So let me spend a few minutes just discussing some objections to this kind of theory. One kind of objection has to do with the claim that emotions are sufficient for moral judgments. And the objection arises because the emotions that I've mentioned, like anger and disgust, can also arise in contexts that have nothing to do with morality. For example, you might be disgusted by seeing somebody eating these insects. So in various places like the Amazon, these insects are eaten as food. I don't know. I like insects. I like to eat insects. So for me, this is just attractive. But for some people, they find eating certain foods disgusting. So if you see this, you have a disgust response. You see someone eating these, and you say, that's disgusting. But you haven't made a moral judgment. You're not saying the person is behaving immorally, even though you're disgusted by the behavior. And that suggests that disgust alone is not enough for making a moral judgment. And here again, I think the distinction between sentiments and emotions is important. In order to have a moral judgment, it's not enough that we feel disgust. We also need to have a disposition to have a self-directed emotion if we engage in the same behavior. So imagine what you would feel if you saw somebody eating a food you find disgusting. This is too much information too, but for some reason I have a strong aversion to bananas. Okay? I don't like bananas. I see bananas, I'm disgusted by bananas. If I see you eating a banana, I would feel disgusted. So if anyone has a banana, please don't take it out. But now ask yourself, what would I feel if I ate a banana? Like suppose somebody put a little banana in my food and I didn't realize it and then I discover it. What emotion would I feel? Disgust as well, right? It's the same emotion. I feel disgust when you eat a banana. I feel disgust when I eat a banana. But remember what emotion you're supposed to feel in the moral case. If you do something immoral, what emotion do you feel towards yourself? Guilt or shame, right? So if you have a disgust response towards another, but you don't have a disposition to feel guilt or shame, it's not a case of moral disgust. Morality requires these two different emotions that go towards other and towards the self. So I think morality always involves these sentiments that bring these different emotions together. The second objection has to do with the following claim that you find often in philosophy. So how many of you are philosophers? So philosophers like to talk about conceptual truth, things that are true because of the concepts that we use. And one example in moral philosophy of a conceptual truth is people say it's a conceptual truth that morality is objective. And one way to express this is that morality would remain in place. A moral claim, a moral fact would remain true even if I didn't feel anything about it. Morality is about the objective world independent of us. It's not about our subjective responses. So if you think it's a conceptual truth that morality is objective, this story, this theory, which relates morality to the emotions, won't be convincing to you. But the claim that morality is objective is not shared by everyone. And in fact, it's been shown experimentally by two psychologists named Jeff Goodwin and John Darley that people have different views about whether morality is objective. Half of the world seems to think that morality is objective, half of it thinks that it's subjective. So we can test in this room. So how many of you think that morality is objective, that moral truths are independent of human emotions? A few of you. How many of you think that morality is subjective? Okay, so what a friendly crowd. If this was this room, we would have a much bigger green bar. But if you actually study this, you can show further that, the slide didn't work, but you can show that the people who are most objectivist also tend to be the most religious. And one way to think about this is that when you have a moral response, it doesn't reveal whether morality is objective or subjective. You don't know one way or the other whether it's subjective or objective. To decide whether it's subjective or objective, you need to study the topic. You need to read moral philosophy, or maybe you need to be trained in a religious tradition. And people who are trained in certain religious traditions come to believe that morality is objective. It's not part of the concept of morality. It's a further belief, quite independent of morality. How many of you have no idea whether morality is objective or subjective? So some of you just don't know. It would take a lot of hard work to decide whether morality is objective or subjective. That suggests that objectivity and subjectivity are not part of the concept at all. We can use moral concepts. We can make moral judgments without any beliefs about this whatsoever. Back to Kant. So Kant thinks that emotions are not necessary for morality. He agrees we sometimes use emotions in making moral judgments, but he thinks that we can, and in fact he thinks we should, stop using emotions in moral judgment. We should use reason to arrive at morality. And I have like 3 minutes left, so I can't refute Kant in 3 minutes. So I'll try to instead indicate why I think Kant's views are not promising. And I can do that with a picture. So this, in my view, and it would take a lot of argument, but just to tell you, in my view, Kant's theory of morality suffers from 3 problems. If we remove morality, if we remove emotion from morality, I think one result is that we end up being lazy. And by this I mean emotions are what motivate us to act. If you don't feel strongly about something, you can believe it's true, but you won't act on it. We need emotions for action. We need emotions for motivation. So if you try to construct morality from reason alone, you won't end up being motivated. You'll sit back and say, yes, I know that action is wrong, but I'm not going to act on it. So we know psychologically emotions are needed for action. A Kantian ethics would be a lazy ethics. I think a Kantian ethics would also be a stupid ethics. And by this I mean, I don't think that reason alone can ever tell us which things are right and which things are wrong. And the reason for this is that when you look at the evidence that I've been presenting, it suggests that emotions are fundamental to how we conceptualize something as right or wrong, what it is to think of something as good or bad. In fact, whenever we make a judgment that involves an evaluation, like this is beautiful, or this is delicious, or this is interesting, we're reporting an emotional state. If you had no emotions, nothing would be beautiful. If you had no emotions, nothing would be interesting. So nothing would be delicious anymore. You wouldn't be capable of recognizing these domains. And I think morality is like that. Without emotion, we could never even discover which things are right and which things are wrong. And I think as a consequence, Kantian ethics runs the risk of turning us into people who are cruel or mean. Because reason can give us a lot of information about what's say, instrumentally valuable, what would be a rational policy in some way that's removed from human interest. But I think that runs a risk of cruelty, where when we stop feeling, we start to treat other human beings as if they were mere statistics. And this is deeply ironic. For those of you who have been exposed to the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, he thinks it's fundamentally important to respect human beings, respect the dignity of human beings. But I think without emotions, that very idea of respect can't arise. Respect is itself emotional. So as a Kantian, you either need to accept that emotions are central to morality, or you need to lose this idea of respect that's so central to Kantian ethics. So I think Kant should be very sad about these results. Will make Kant frown. Let me make a final remark, because in criticizing Kant, I might give the impression that emotions are all we need for morality. We don't need to reason at all. Reasoning is irrelevant. That's not my view. So you might object that reasoning is used in the moral domain frequently. We give reasons for our moral views. And the emotional theory doesn't seem to make room for this. But I think the emotional theory does provide a role for reasoning. And it begins with a distinction between values that are fundamental, basic, are foundations in morality, and values that are not basic, values that we derive from the basic values. And I think that the move from a basic value to a non-basic value fundamentally involves reasoning, but we rely on emotions for the basic values. So reason and emotion work together. Emotions tell you that it's wrong to harm another person, but reason tells you which things count as cases of harm. And this is the last slide. You can consider an example like euthanasia, que es la palabra en español también. So if you ask yourself, is it morally wrong to commit an act of euthanasia? That's very difficult. You might need to spend hours thinking about it. You might need to read books, consult ethicists. It's a very, very difficult question, and you need reasoning to answer it. But if I ask you, is it wrong to kill an innocent person, you'll all immediately say yes. It's wrong to kill someone. Killing an innocent person is wrong. So emotions tell us that killing is wrong, killing an innocent person is wrong, but reason tells us whether euthanasia is really a case of killing. Emotions tell us that injustice is wrong. But suppose I now ask a question, is it morally permissible to tax inherited wealth? So in Peru, as in the United States, if you inherit money from a relative, there's a tax on that. And somebody might say, well, I shouldn't have to pay tax on this. This was my family's money. Why should I pay any tax? And some people think that it's unjust to pay an inheritance tax. Other people think that this is a case of justice, of distributive justice. People shouldn't get money from birthright. They shouldn't get money by inheritance. They should get money by working for it. So if you get money because you have a wealthy family, that's a case of injustice. So there are very elaborate debates using reasoning about whether certain tax policies are moral or immoral. We need reasoning for that, but we don't need reasoning to know that injustice is wrong. We don't need reasoning to know that it's wrong to harm the body, to physically cause pain or mutilation. But consider a traditional ritual like vaginal circumcision, which is practiced in many parts of the world, where part of the body is modified surgically. And you ask, is this a case of bodily harm? That may involve a lot of reasoning. You need to know a lot about the practice. Is consent involved, and so on. Reasoning is important there, even though the basic value is emotional. So I think reason and emotion work together in this way. It's just that emotions are foundational. And because emotions are foundational, I think that David Hume was right. David Hume's theory of morality that says that when we make moral judgments, we're expressing how we feel, finds support in the scientific evidence. So this battle between the squirrels at the beginning, very difficult to resolve, but when we bring the cognitive science to bear, we find some evidence that Hume is right, will make Hume smile once more. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Jesse, for your excellent talk. We have some time for questions and debate now. Tenemos tiempo para preguntas y debate. Si quieren formularlas en inglés, está bien. Si prefieren hacerlo en castellano, yo podría traducírselo a Jesse, aunque Jesse entendería las preguntas en castellano quizá también, ¿no? Así que si fueran tan amables de levantar la mano, quienes tengan interés en formular preguntas.
Hi, in the first place, I would like to congratulate you because it was a very interesting exposition. My question I would like to ask how this emotion works, or how this emotion the origin of this emotion. But I know that tomorrow that will be other team. I would like to ask how different are emotion in other cultures? Because I think emotion works in all cultures, but what make us or produce us disgust or happiness or other emotion can be different. Well, that's
It's a wonderful question. Those topics interest me greatly. The question about the origins of these emotions is a big and difficult topic. One brief answer is that in the case of anger and disgust, we can see why these emotions play different roles in morality by thinking about their roles outside of morality. So, for example, suppose you have no moral sense. You don't have any moral values. But I attack you. I physically aggress against you. Maybe you're not even human. Maybe you're a monkey, or maybe even a lioness, some animal. If I aggress against you with violence, you respond with violence. So violence, an aggressive response, is the basis of anger. The reason why anger gets adapted to the moral domain in cases of harm is it is a biologically evolved emotion that really serves to protect us against aggression. And what happens with socialization is we take our basic instinct to self-preservation, to self-protection against aggression, and we turn it into more general rules. So if you're an animal, you'll get angry at me, you'll get violent with me if I'm violent with you, but you don't care about anyone else. You might not have a general rule that says you should be angry or violent whenever you see violence. But as a human being, you're able to extend that aggression response and make a general rule. And disgust plays a similar plays a different biological role. It's used to protect the body against contamination. If you see decay, if you see a rotting meat or something that involves sickness or decay, it can be disgusting. In morality, there are certain norms that involve the body. So norms about sexuality involve the body. By nature, there's very little in sexuality that we find disgusting. But socialization can take this basic emotion that's used to protect the body and adapt it to these cases where a society wants to regulate sexual behavior or behavior involving the body. And that brings us to the second part of your question, because I think every culture has its own history. Every culture has its own interests, and which things get considered morally wrong in one culture can vary from which things get considered morally wrong in another. And they often depend in extremely specific ways on the history of that culture. So attitudes towards sexuality are extremely different across societies. Many societies are polygamous, or polygynous, they allow one man to marry multiple women. Some societies are monogamous, some are even polyandrous, where one woman marries several men. The history of the society is necessary to understand if we want to see these differences. And the emotions themselves may be similar, but they can also adjust and shift within cultural contexts. But the biggest role of culture is in shifting which events cause these emotions. For example, Clifford Geertz, who is an anthropologist who studied emotional responses in Bali, found that people were disgusted by the sight of a crawling child, a crawling baby, a baby walking on 4 limbs. And you say, well, how can a baby crawling be disgusting? This is very cute and sweet. And he asked people in Bali, why are you disgusted by this? And he said, because they look like animals. But the socialization leads them to see that connection between young children and animals. So they hold their children throughout childhood and until they're able to walk to prevent them from acting like animals. Only when you can walk on 2 legs are you truly human. Very, very culturally specific allocation of disgust.
Gracias. I will speak in Spanish just to be more fluid. It's okay. Me encantó la presentación, pero yo discrepo al 100% contigo. ¿No? Casi en todo. Pero para no hacerlo largo, yo quiero que de repente me podrías profundizar en un par de cositas, ¿no? La primera es que yo no entiendo cómo las emociones pueden ser fundacionales de algo moral. Ni siquiera en lo más básico. Cuando tú dices, ¿no? Por ejemplo, las emociones básicas pueden fundamentar valores básicos. Por ejemplo, ¿no? Todos sabemos que está mal o es, ¿no? Hacer daño físico al otro. Pero para saber eso, yo no veo cómo la emoción nos puede permitir saber eso, porque uno puede saber que está mal hacer daño al otro por diferentes razones. No es lo mismo saber que está mal hacer daño al otro, y te digo, ¿por qué está mal? Y me dice, porque me castigan, me meten a la cárcel, me pega a mi papá, que tener una explicación de por qué el otro pues tiene derecho a la integridad de su cuerpo, o porque me pongo en su lugar y puedo, ¿no? Anticipar que le va a doler, etc. Entonces, incluso en lo más básico, tengo que tener razón, no basta la emoción. Para mí, ese es un punto importante que me gustaría que expliques. Y el otro que está bien vinculado es lo que, si entendí bien, tú dijiste que para que algo sea moral, uno tendría que experimentar hacia uno mismo las emociones de guilt and shame, ¿verdad? Que es vergüenza, no es pena, pena es en el Caribe, en Centroamérica, es vergüenza, ¿qué? Vergüenza y culpa.
Sí.
Ok, pero para experimentar esas emociones necesitamos cognición. Esas emociones no se experimentan si es que no hay una construcción del self que es absolutamente cognitivo. Tienes ideas y razones de por qué tú quieres ser la persona que quieres ser y con eso contrastas tu acción y por eso sientes shame o sientes guilt. Sí. No son automáticas. Solo digo esas 2 cosas porque te podría decir 3 o 4 más, pero no sé qué nos podrías explicar.
I think we may not disagree as much as it seems. I think there are some moral psychologists who want to say it's nothing but emotion. I think cognition is extremely important, and for 2 reasons. One is the reason I gave, which is that if you have a basic value, you need to extend that, apply that to new cases. Every time you're confronted with a real-world scenario, you have to decide which of my values is relevant here. And that's a very cognitive activity. But cognition comes in another place, a related place, but even to just understand what has occurred, what action has occurred, a lot of cognition has to be involved. For example, in morality, it's very important to us in some cases to know whether an action was performed intentionally or accidentally. And And that requires cognition. So for that, we need cognition. So we need cognition to understand what the action is and whether it's an instance of a rule that we've already internalized. I think where we disagree may be in the nature of emotions themselves, because there are some people who think emotions themselves require cognition, that emotions are judgments or are cognitive, and there are some people who disagree with that. And that would be a very long conversation. If emotions are cognition, if emotions require judgment, then I think the two extreme views actually become one, and then we can all agree. If emotions are separate from cognition, then a lot of the disagreement we have comes down to scientific questions in developmental psychology, which have to do with how people acquire these moral norms in the first place. Is it through conditioning emotions in a non-cognitive way, for example, through association, or is it through a more cognitively mediated learning process where people are made to understand features of the action that become sufficient for making a moral judgment? So I think I haven't presented enough evidence here about child development to really convince you that the sentimental story is true.
Hello. I read some of your papers, and I know that you are kind of you don't like just to focus, for example, on evolutionary psychology. You look for interdisciplinary explanations for your theory. But I would like to know which are the limits of these evolutionist explanations for explaining morality, which could be their main contributions to your thesis.
Wonderful question, a big question as well. Let me describe an extreme view first. So sometimes I'm inclined to say that evolution has about as much to do with morality as it has to do with clothing, the clothing that we wear, which is something. Evolution can tell us something about clothing. For example, the human capacity to make tools, to manipulate the environment, the human ability to reason, the fact that human beings don't have fur or hair covering our skin, all of that has to do with our evolution. So you need some story about human nature to explain how we create clothing. But the vast variety in clothing that we create, the differences in the kinds of clothing we create for different climates, all of these very specific facts are not explained by evolution at all. And when evolution makes a contribution, it's not by postulating the existence of a clothing module, a special capacity for clothing. It's by more general capacities like intelligence and tool use. So I think in some moods, I want to say morality is just like that. Evolution is important, but it's really a very limited part of the story. But I think a more modest proposal would say that evolution actually gives us a little bit more. It gives us, we human beings are very social animals. And evolution has placed social dispositions in us that affect the way we behave with other people. And a lot of those behavioral dispositions become a kind of a starting place for morality. So, for example, we might be evolved to reciprocate good behavior. So if you do something nice to me, I'll do something nice for you. And that might be that might be an evolved response. But it's not yet a moral response. So you can, if you just go to the market and exchange some money for food, you don't consider that a moral behavior. But in many societies, it gets moralized. We start to think of these exchanges in moral terms. So you can begin with something that is purely economic, not yet moral, and you can start to see it as a moral obligation. Evolution gives us the social economic behavior, but culture and socialization give that a moral flavor, a moral quality. We have lots of evolved behavioral dispositions. Any of them could become part of the moral domain, but it's always a matter of history which ones become part of morality and which ones don't.
Well, I want to ask, in the case when you're the bad guy, what happens when, well, in the case you put us, when you push the fat guy through the brick, you're confronting a positive emotion with a negative emotion, but both are moral, because the positive emotion is saving 5 people. But what happens when, I don't know, your mother bakes cookies and leaves them on the table, and she tells you, don't eat any one of them. And then you're there, and you know that you have negative emotion when you said, well, I can't, because they're for the guests that my mother has invited. But I know that I will get pleasure, and there's an emotion. So in this emotion, it's not a moral emotion. It's not an emotion that you could relate with moral, because I'm not saving anybody or anything, but it's still emotion. How do you contrast that emotion with the guilt I will have from eating the cookie?
Oh, that's really good, difficult, interesting question. Yeah, so in this kind of moral dilemma, there's a negative side and the positive side. The negative side looks moral because you have both. You might feel guilt afterwards if you took the cookies. Your mother would be angry if you took the cookies. So it seems okay to say that the negative side is moral, but what about the positive side? So all I told you about positive emotions in the moral case is that they involve positive feelings, pleasure. But I haven't told you what distinguishes the positive feelings in the moral cases from the positive feelings in the immoral cases. And the short answer is I really don't know. For me, this is a question I'm extremely interested in. I've been thinking about a lot lately, but I think we don't know the answer. One possibility has to do with a slide I showed very, very quickly about differentiating these positive emotions. So the question is, what do you feel when you do something good for another person? It might feel pleasurable, but it's a different kind of pleasure than the pleasure you get from eating cookies. And I don't know if we have done enough of the theoretical work, the philosophy, or the psychology to really fully describe that difference. I think if you look at research on the emotions, we tend to get one positive emotion, happiness, pleasure, joy, and then lots of negative emotions. But in fact, there are many different positive emotions, and they haven't been investigated. There's some current work looking at pride. There's other work looking at an emotion that's called elevation, which is if you hear a story about somebody acting very heroically, you might feel elevated, like you're larger. But we're only at the beginning of research on these emotions. In our music studies, we tried 2 different conditions. In one, we used the song that I played for you from Grieg, that's very pleasant. And in another, we used a piece by Wagner, Richard Wagner, that also makes people feel happy, but also powerful. This is an experiment in progress, so we don't have the full results, but we're starting to see some differences. So in terms of the effect on moral judgment, the pleasant music seems to be more effective than the powerful music. And that suggests there may be a difference here. But there's a further difference, and this is the last thing I'll say. If you think about this structure in the negative case, I suggested that there are 2 different emotions depending on whether you are performing the action or someone else. In the positive case, that might be true as well. So if you help somebody in need, you might feel a certain kind of pride. You might feel good about yourself. If you see somebody else help somebody in need, you might feel admiration. You might see that person as a hero. You might look up to that person. So it's a different emotional response in both cases. But if you eat cookies, you'll feel pleasure. If you see somebody else eating cookies, maybe if you like the person, you'll feel pleasure. If you dislike the person, you'll feel jealousy or something like that. So the pattern of emotions between self and other differ in the moral case and these non-moral cases.
Thank you, Professor. Nice talk. I was wondering if you could talk about something about normative ethics, because I think, let me state the point better. I think your position is very descriptive, but I don't know if it is enough to help us in order to know how to exchange socially. And maybe you could say something about normative ethics and I don't know, a couple of words about that in contrast with your descriptive position.
It was just a little difficult, un poco difícil oír the last point.
To listen, well, let me state the point again. I think your position is very descriptive. And,
as opposed to normative. Restrictive.
With the descriptive.
Okay.
So I was wondering if you could say a word regarding normative ethics and the contrast between
regarding
normative ethics.
Normative ethics, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's my point.
Good. Sorry. It's not you. It's the
I
sound
think it's me.
in the room. No. A very good question. For others who didn't hear, in philosophy we draw a distinction between descriptive ethics, which describes how people make moral judgments, and normative ethics, which tells people what to do. So a normative ethicist constructs a theory of which actions are good, which actions are bad. So, for example, utilitarian philosophers like John Stuart Mill say it's good to increase pleasure, and the right action, the correct action, is the one that maximizes, that creates the most possible pleasure or happiness. I myself think that normative ethics is very problematic. And it's problematic because I don't think there's a single true morality. And as a result, when we engage in normative ethics, we are really engaging in an exercise of self-expression. When you're talking to people who are similar to you, who have a similar cultural background, for instance, a similar set of values, there is a genuine project of figuring out what your values require of you. You might say to a friend, maybe you're a political leftist, and you say, I know you believe in the left, but your practices are exploitational. You're consuming products that are not produced through fair trade, something like that. You criticize, and that's a genuine case of normative criticism, but it depends on the fact that your friend shares your values. Now, you might encounter somebody on the right, somebody who has political values that are conservative on the right wing, and this argument won't be effective. But you might find some other common ground, some other thing you share with them, like you say, you think everyone believes in an equal opportunity, and your practices don't, you say everyone has the right to self-mastery and could achieve success, but you're actually promoting policies that hold certain people down. And maybe that's something they'll agree with, and then they can be corrected through your normative critique. So I think there is room for that kind of normative ethics. The real problem arises when we try to express our normative values to people who have no commonality with us, or for people who have values that differ from us to such a degree that the things that count as moral reasons for us don't look like reasons to them. The analogy is to, say, music taste. So if I like punk rock, and if I say I like this noisy, fast music, and I play this song for you, and I say, I really love this, you should love it too. And you say, well, I don't like noisy, fast music. Somebody might say to me, what's good about this music? And I say, it's fast. I remember as a kid, a band called the Bad Brains produced a record that was the fastest song I'd ever heard. And that's what made it good. For me, this was a virtue. If music is fast, the faster, the better. But if you don't share that value, I can't tell you, you should like this music, because the reason I have is not a reason for you. So I think a lot of moral conflict arises because people have different foundational values. And I think that philosophers who have tried to find a universal set of norms have been very ambitious and really in some ways breathtakingly successful in their ability to locate aspects of morality that are very widely shared. but they always run into trouble when they try to take these very abstract principles and apply them to real life. Because suddenly we start to see local differences occurring, and the abstract principles are very difficult to apply. When we get to specificity, when we get to the particular cases, they often fall silent. And at that point, the normative project of philosophers no longer works.
Okay, hello, Jesse. In terms of experimental psychology, I was wondering in which measure this discipline contemplates the fact that real situations lead on to more complex responses than a imagined induced situation.
Great, yeah, which is related to what I was just saying about these particular cases. I think moral psychology of the kind I described is in its infancy. And I think in some ways it's a big advantage to take these cases that are very simplified when you're trying to get at the basic mechanisms that are involved in morality. So if you want to show that emotion is involved in morality, take a very simple case and you can establish that. But suppose you want to understand much more specifically which particular things people find morally wrong, which particular variables affect moral judgment. Then I think the cases need to become much more specific, and much more context needs to be given. And some moral psychologists have been doing very clever work of this kind. So, for example, with these trolley cases, these train cases, people have looked at a lot of different variables. So suppose the number of people that you save is not 5, but 50 or 500. Or suppose you're told that that the people who are going to get killed are members of your social group or members of a different social group. All of these things can make a difference. David Pizarro, a psychologist I greatly admire, did a version of the trolley study in North America where he manipulated the ethnicity of the victims. And these were white college students in a very elite university, Cornell University in North America, but very liberal college students, politically liberal. And when he told people that the victims, the 5 people sitting on the train track, were very elite, were very wealthy, they thought it was more permissible to let them die. And when he said they're members of the Harlem Boys Choir, so African Americans from a more impoverished neighborhood, they thought their lives shouldn't be sacrificed. So it depends who the victims are, it depends how you kill them, all of these variables make a difference. The controlled experiments allow us to isolate each of these and study them, but there's too much temptation to infer from a single study that there is a general pattern here. So I think until we've really manipulated every possible variable, but also tried to study these things in a more natural environment, look at how people make real moral decisions in their lives, we won't have a complete picture.
I had a doubt about the shift in the moral values from a particular culture from one time period to another. Let's say their views about marriage. What explains that shift in emotional responses in the society?
What explains the shift in what is the case again?
Let's say Western civilization in the 19th century.
Okay.
Their position about, gay marriage.
Yeah.
And right now, the emotional responses, change from time to time.
Great. This is a topic that fascinates me greatly. I actually have a background in continental philosophy, and in my student days I was very interested in the work of people like Michel Foucault, who study exactly these kinds of questions, changes in values over time. And I think there's no general answer. So I think in each case, one way to think about it is that moral values are historical artifacts, and each of them has a history. So to take your example, gay marriage, what's caused a change in attitudes towards gay marriage? And There are various possibilities, and I think no single answer even there will suffice. For each culture it's different. But one striking fact is that for the first time in human history, as far as we know, it is more costly to have many children than to have few. In previous times when you had many children, they could work for the home. They could bring wealth to the family. A large family was a good thing. And the wealthier you were, the more children you would have, because you would have a family farm or a family business. So wealthy people had an especially strong interest in having many kids. But now the opposite is true. Wealthy people have fewer children than the poor, and wealthy children do worse when they have children than when they don't. A middle-class, post-industrial couple who are deciding whether they should procreate have to face the reality that having children will be extremely costly to them, with very little benefit beyond the joy of having created another human life. That's a big benefit, but it's, economically not a benefit. So gay marriage becomes acceptable at a time when childbirth becomes costly. So I don't want to oversimplify and say it's a law that as soon as childbirth becomes costly, people will become tolerant of gay marriage. But I do think this is a real factor, that a change in the material conditions of culture have had a dramatic impact on which moral possibilities we consider. And in the case of gay marriage, it's really quite striking that the tolerance for it has occurred at exactly the moment when the cost structure of procreation has changed.
I will take again that example of the gay marriage. If I have understood what you are proposing, if someone finds that some situation, for instance, gay marriage, is morally wrong, then he feels disgust, the emotion of disgust about that situation. Now, how it would be possible for that person to find out that that feeling, that emotion, is morally wrong? So,
Yeah,
that person still always have the emotion of disgust, but comes to the conclusion, rationally, at Kant, that emotion is wrong. Morally wrong.
Great question. I think these are cases of moral conflict. So, for example, in the United States, interracial marriage was not legalized, was not affirmed by the Supreme Court until 1963. So it's very recent. That meant that in many parts of the country it was legal, but in some parts of the country it was illegal to marry a member of a different ethnic group. Until 1963, so very recently, right? It's really sort of chilling to hear that. And of course now there's really been this big moral change where now people can't imagine life in a time when this was illegal. I think aside from these very material or historical factors that can allow for this change, what happens in the case of an individual is they discover a conflict. And they discover that on the one hand they have a disgust response to gay marriage or to interracial marriage, but on the other hand they have a very strong, equally emotional conviction that adults, individuals have the right to do what they want with their own bodies. So they have a very general norm that says we shouldn't interfere with the activity of consenting adults if no one else is hurt. These two things are logically inconsistent. They're actually, you can generate a contradiction. So when you're faced with a contradiction, you have two choices. I mean, you can live with the contradiction, or you can resolve it through change. And one way to change it is to get rid of your egalitarian value and say, it's not true that consenting adults can do whatever they want with their bodies. Another way to change it is to get rid of the disgust response or the negative moral judgment against gay marriage or against interracial marriage. For those who, I think it's difficult to know in general how this conflict gets resolved. One way to think about it is by analogy to scientific change. And one theory of scientific change is a holistic theory which says when you discover a conflict between evidence and theory, you should adjust whichever one is easier to adjust without having a big effect on everything else you believe. And since it would be very, very damaging to remove our egalitarian value that says consenting adults can control their own body, and not very damaging to change this very isolated value about gay marriage, people end up very often choosing this option that says, let me criticize my value about gay marriage. But two further comments briefly on that. Once you've made that decision, the disgust response doesn't disappear, it doesn't evaporate. And I think for a long time you experience a true moral conflict where you continue to have this first reaction that it's immoral, and then you have a moral correction which says, not only is it morally permissible, but I am a bad person for continuing to think that it's immoral. It's a little bit like racism. By most measures, people come out to be racist, even if they're members of groups that have been victimized. But they can discover that racism in themselves and criticize it. We don't say they're no longer racist. We say they have two values, the racist values and the non-racist values, and they try to get the racist values to be corrected by the non-racist values. But the other thing to say is there are some people who resolve the conflict in the other direction. So a very interesting question for us as scientists and philosophers is, why does that happen? And so here's a prediction. I hadn't thought about this till now, but a prediction is that when you take somebody who continues to think that gay marriage is wrong, once it's been pointed out to them that that's inconsistent with their views about individual rights and privacy, the reason why they continue to think it's wrong is the wrongness of gay marriage must be in some way more central to their value system than it is for others. So the prediction would be, if you take, say, somebody who is committed to opposing gay marriage because of a certain interpretation of Christianity, Christianity is a very central part of their value system. They don't want to give that up. So if accepting gay marriage means giving up on Christianity, that's too big a cost to pay. So from a holistic perspective, we can predict that people who are against gay marriage because of not this local form of disgust, but this systematic connection to their religious beliefs, those people will be more reluctant to change.
Gracias por la conferencia, muy interesante. Yo me quedo pensando en el tema de cómo cambian los valores, ¿no? Lo rápido que cambian. Viendo a Teresa de Calcuta, me imaginaba que en poco tiempo ya no iba a ser una heroína, digamos, sino porque creo que, por ejemplo, el tema del neoliberalismo, del individualismo, está convirtiendo a la solidaridad, a la caridad, al altruismo en malas palabras, ¿no? Que nuestros nuevos héroes son otros, ¿no? Yo, por ejemplo, me estaba pensando en este joven universitario que hace poco mató a un ladrón por robarle, por defender su billetera, ¿no? Y no es el único, hay muchos casos. ¿Cómo cambian los valores? ¿Cómo cambian los héroes? ¿Qué tan rápido cambian? Tú has hablado que en el 63 el matrimonio interracial estaba prohibido. Yo estaba pensando en el tema de la violencia contra la mujer. En fin, el tema de cómo cambian, ¿no? ¿Qué tan rápido cambian los valores y los héroes en estos tiempos?
I'm so grateful for these questions because they connect to things that I'm personally very, very interested in. For some reason in North America, if you talk about the change in values, people don't find that interesting. I think North Americans are not interested in history in general, especially in philosophy. I think that this there are ways of thinking about change scientifically, where you look for variables that have an impact. And science always seeks generalizations. So I think if you're trying to approach the question scientifically, you'll look at a general variable that could affect many different cases. And for me, I think material variables that have to do with material resources, with economics, are among the most important if you want to achieve generalization. So I think if you consider some of these cases like marriage norms, if you want to know which societies will find polygamy acceptable, the answer will be polygamy is more likely to be acceptable in societies where that family structure is financially advantageous. And monogamy will be more desirable in societies where monogamy is more advantageous. But I think that sort of explanation only explains a little bit. Because so much of explanation in these cases is going to be particular. It's going to depend on the specific events that occurred in the history of a given culture. And because of that, there's a way in which the study of moral change is not going to look like science. It's going to look more like narrative, which is really what historians do already. They describe a particular event that led to a change in history. And I think those stories are equally interesting, equally important. And what we'll often find in our own case is that the narratives, the stories that explain the values we have today, have very little to do with economic factors. They have very little to do with what's economically advantageous for us, and have a lot to do with things like power struggles in the history of our society. And this is really an insight that Nietzsche had. And if you think about philosophies of history, you can see a strong contrast between people like Marx or Hegel, who emphasize a very lawful view of history, where there's a kind of historical determinism that events have to unfold in a particular way, and Nietzsche, who has a very narrative view of history. And I think we shouldn't try and decide who's right. We should accept that both of these views are right, and in each case we need to look at which is involved in our own morality. And in cases where the economic variables have been important, that might be used in trying to justify a moral norm by saying it's advantageous, it's helpful for us to be in a monogamous society, for example, as opposed to a polygamous society. But in some cases we'll find that the norm is simply a product of a past historical event, maybe a power struggle that's no longer relevant today. So those particular facts about history can be used as a form of moral critique, which is, of course, exactly what Nietzsche had recommended. Okay.
My question is about the relationship between moral development and emotional development. Attachment relationship is supposed to be the ontogenetic scenario that facilitates self-regulation and affect regulation in infancy. What do you think is the role of this early relationship in the origins of morality?
Wonderful question. I don't know if people could hear, but the question is, what is the role of attachment, the attachment relationship in morality? So psychologists who study child development have done research on a connection that's found between children and their parents that's called attachment, and there can be different kinds of attachment relationships. You might have a stable connection to your parents or an unstable relationship and so on. And there hasn't been much research connecting attachment to morality, but I think it's very important. One place in which I think it's important is with the development of guilt. If you study guilt, people used to think that guilt is just a response to anything that's a violation of a moral rule. But if you study guilt, it looks like the things that make us most guilty are when you harm somebody who you're close to. Harm a member of your group, a loved one, a family member. So this suggests that guilt might emerge out of a kind of threat to attachment. That in childhood, when a parent engages in love withdrawal, when they say, I'm not going to play with you anymore, you're not the kind of child I like, that's a very, very strong threat to attachment. And it creates two things. It creates sadness, a sense of loss. This parent, this person who I need and care about is no longer showing affection. And it creates anxiety. How will I survive without this person's affection? And it's only if you feel attachment that you feel these two things. You might describe guilt as a combination of anxiety and sadness brought about by a threatened attachment relationship. At least that's how it begins. And as guilt continues to develop throughout the lifespan, it becomes an emotion that doesn't depend on attachment, but I think it may begin that way.
Bueno, me temo que nos tenemos que quedar acá por la hora. Thank you very much, Jesse. Till tomorrow.